Good morning. We are reviewing the conclusion of Ayin Beis. We are on page 1407. Aleph Tav Zayin. We finished the paragraph. Let's review and then continue. So as I say, it's a review of the conclusion because we've already learned this first time around a few years ago. And then we finished the Hemshech, and then we went back to different source material and other associated content from different places in order to understand the context, as well as try to piece together the puzzle of what the conclusion of Ayin Beis would have been, the answers to the questions, the themes that were not finished completely. And that's what we're really doing right now in this second round. So now where we are, a very crucial piece in the whole puzzle is, of course, the relationship between the neshama souls sent by God to this world and manifesting within bodies, each one of us, a neshama beguf, using Torah and mitzvahs as God's instruments, divine wisdom and will, God's blueprint, God's plan, what God wants of us and what He wants of existence of this world. So you have here, if you want to put it in a sense, a few pieces that work together. There's the world that God created in 6 days. As we read, Bereshis bara Elokim, He created in 6 days all of this world with all its details. There's the human being placed in this world, Adam and Chava, male and female, the Ovda L'Shamra, to serve and protect and transform this world into a divine home, a dir b'tachtenim. So in the beginning of creation, as we know, Elokus was manifest here, Ikar Shechina b'tachtenim, like we learn in the beginning of Basar Legani, the famous Basar Legani, Tavshniyut from the Medrash Shir Hashirim Rabbah. But then the Chet, they chose wrongly, and the Chet Sadas concealed that divine. This human being consists of a soul and a body. So on one hand, a body that's made up of this earth, and a soul which has a divine soul, that God imbued, the offer min hadama, the earth, the dust from the earth. And as Rashi says, that He gathered the earth from all over the world. So now you have here the first interface, a human being, a divine soul within a physical body, coming to transform a physical material universe into a home for God. But then comes the final piece, is Torah mitzvahs. So even though Adam and Chava did not receive the Torah formally, they did keep it to some extent, as it says in Chazal, and Chassidus explains the meaning of that. But 26 generations later, after the preparations by Adam and Chava and all the generations, especially the Avis, we know that Avraham Avinu began to bring the Shekhinah down. By the time it came to Moshe Rabbeinu, 7 generations from Avraham, after Yetzias Mitzrayim, now the people were ready to receive the Torah, the power to actually transform the world in its fullest sense with Torah and mitzvahs. The formal giving, Matan Torah, and receiving of Torah and mitzvahs. So now you have the full, everything is complete. The stage is set. A world created, and a neshama and a guf placed in this world, the human being, following Torah and mitzvahs, and you have all the tools and resources necessary to fulfill the purpose of why God created the world in the first place, which is in order to turn it into a dir b'tachtenim, through taking the material world, which on its own is concealed. The divine within it is concealed, even though it is created by Elokus, and all of its true reality is divine, because every second, the perpetual creation existence couldn't stand on its own without Elokus, without the divine koyach eliki within it. And it's the God of the Creator that is constantly sustaining and perpetually sustaining existence, but it's concealed. So the neshama, the guf, using Torah mitzvahs, reveals the divine within existence to the point that it transforms it all into a seamless vehicle, seamless channel, what we call a home for dir b'tachtenim. Interestingly, as Rocha Pratis happen to be teaching now, Tanya, chapter 23,
which is essentially what some of what I just said is there explicitly. There he talks about how Torah mitzvahs, because they reflect the divine unity, in contrast to the physical world, which does not reflect it without work. Torah mitzvahs, when you take them and you use them and you actualize them in the physical world, they serve as that interface. He doesn't talk so much there about neshamas per se, but obviously Torah mitzvahs can't be done on their own. It's always a neshama that's doing it. So it also connects to that idea, and it's good to look into that chapter, because there he also talks about the concealments that the world is subject to. That's why there's an independent consciousness called the Yesh. And then how Torah mitzvahs, through the neshama's work, begins to reverse that process, turning the Yesh from the Yesh to an Ayin. Okay. Now, in the general terms of Ayin Beis, the interface that I'm describing right now, the interface between divine and existence, which is actualized through neshamas using Torah and mitzvahs, which of course is also the 3 points in the Maimer HaMagbiel Sheves, that the neshama's contemplation of divine unity affects the animal soul. But then in addition to that, the neshama has the resources called Ner Mitzvah and Torah Er. So you have Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the wick of the divine soul, inserted within the oil of the animal soul, which in turn is meant to convert that oil, that intelligence, human intelligence that's self-absorbed, to turn that into fuel for divine love and divine light. That's the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the Oir. So too, mitzvahs are inserted within the physical world, as we learned, and they transform the physical world and help the neshama achieve that goal. And Torah Er lifts it up to the level of, or I should say, Torah Er is the Hamshachim Amayl Lamata, the interface from the top down, which introduces Er Atzmi, as we've been learning at length earlier about how Torah is the Er Atzmi, because it, more than mitzvahs and more than neshamas, have in a revealed way, it's a Raisa V'Kudsha B'Richu Kulachad, like he explains in chapter 23 in Tanya, the mile of Torah, even over mitzvahs, the mile of Torah over tefillah. He actually referred to it earlier, a few pages earlier, that chapter 23, at the bottom of, I believe, when he spoke about, where was that? So a few pages, I think it was, let's see if I can find it quickly. What is it? And it was a few pages back he brought that. I don't remember exactly where it was. Oh, yeah, page 1404, close to the bottom. Okay, now, that's a general overview. I want to bring this back now to where we are and try to also address some of the questions that you've been asking yesterday's class, before that, some of it in writing in the group, in the Ayin Beis group. So let me say this. Being that we're talking about very high, subtle levels that none of us have seen, and we can't go ahead and examine it empirically, so that's why Chassidus Chabad gives us, in addition, examples. You get physical examples that we can mipsari, from my flesh I behold God, mipsari echzelika. We look at the world around us. So in this world, God created metaphors and examples to understand how God works. So in the very art of existence, in the very nature of existence, you find clues, and more than that, you find examples. So when we, let's say, talk about spheres are spiritual entities. But koiches hanefesh are faculties within us. We may not see faculties but we can relate to them because we have them. The power of vision, the power of sight, of sound, of using my, writing, intelligence, emotions. The faculties evolved, in the words of Tanya, nishtalshlu mahem, from the 10 spheres. So essentially, the more you look at examples from our reality, the more concrete and, I would say, even palpable and palatable these ideas become, because you have something to associate with. Even here, as we explain, a lot of this has been around the concept of vision. And he's using the eye as an example. And we'll soon be reading about it back again, that Einehe Eda and Teira Eir, and the neshamas are like an eye, the neshamas are like an eye, the eye as it manifests in the physical vessel of the physical eye, the vessel, there are limitations. It needs a siyua, an outside light to illuminate. That's the light of Torah, the light of Einei Ha'eda, the leaders. But then there's the koyach hariyah, etzem koyach hariyah, as it is in etzem hanefesh, and there are no limitations, but you have to access that. So you see, again, using a physical example helps us understand a spiritual concept. And more than just a spiritual concept, even these higher levels. That's why I've been using the example, which is not my example. It's an example from Chassidus. Dira b'tachtenim is an example of a home in this world. So we've been talking about a father, right, building a home for his children. And then I'm sending you into this home, and I want you to beautify it, refine it, and turn it into a complete dira b'tachtenim for me. Which essentially, if you put it into the example, that's the example. What does it refer to? It refers to Neshamas Yisrael, the children. Bonim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. They are, we talk the DNA, a piece of the Father, so to speak. They have the Neshamas power, like I said, Tzelem Elokim. The different expressions we'll soon get into more detail. They come into Neshama Beguf, in a body, into a physical world, which is this building that God created. It's God's building. He created this building with the goal that these neshamas, with their divine power, will transform this world into a home for God. Using Torah and mitzvahs are the instruments that they use. Torah which illuminates the guiding light, what they should do. How do you build this home? You have to follow an operator's manual. You need to have a blueprint. That's the Torah. And then what are the actions you need to do? Those are the mitzvahs. So you see a world, you see, for example, a tree. What should you be doing with this tree? Do you eat from its fruit? Do you not eat from its fruit? How do you eat from its fruit? You see animals. You take hide from an animal, you turn it into parchment. How do you turn that parchment into a Sefer Torah, into a tefillin, into a mezuzah, a lulav, a esrog, hadassim, aravis? I mean, the list goes on. This whole physical world, what is it that you do to make it into a home for God? By aligning a physical reality that on its own would just follow its own needs. Like we spoke earlier about the Nefesh Habamis, self-interest. Because all the Helamas and Hestadim, starting from the Tzimtzum, have concealed the divine within existence. So it's not just going to reveal itself. We need something outside of the system to change the system. That's where Neshamas Begufim come into play, using Torah mitzvahs, which also are outside of the system, but they enter into the system. It's not Elikus Erein Sof Lefnei Tzimtzum we're talking about. We're talking about a Torah and a mitzvahs that descend down into this world in a very manifest way, neshamas that come down into this world, and together they take this world and turn it into a home. This is critical to understand what we're even learning right now. So now the Rebbe Rashab, what he's doing us is bestowing a gift upon us by dissecting and breaking down a little more what exactly are the dynamics of this process. What is Torah exactly, and what are neshamas? Namely, those are the two key operative ideas he's discussing here, how they interact with each other. On one hand, we find Torah is higher than neshamas. And that's obvious because the neshama comes down below on a giluyim level, meaning to be able to actualize. The neshama is also concealed. So Torah helps illuminate and guide the neshama and empower it to be able to use its faculties to transform the world around it, as we've been learning. On the other hand, we learn the neshamas are higher than Torah. So he explained, because the neshamas in their root, not as they come down below, in their root, they're higher than Torah. And so now the last few pages, especially, I would say, starting from page 1403, and going through it, now specifically the last two pages, he's talking now about the mila of neshamas, and taking us all the way to the highest place of where the neshamas actually are rooted from, which gives us a deeper understanding how the neshamas have the power to achieve what we're talking about, because they are ultimately divine ambassadors or divine agents that have the power of the Tzelem Elokim, or the words Vayipach Ba'apav Nishmas Chayim, which the Alter Rebbe in chapter 2 in Tanya calls the Chelik Elokam Emal Mamish, based on that posuk, Ba'apav Vayipach Metechi Yusei Nofach. It comes from within the inner dimension. In other words, you're getting now the inner purpose of God, like he says in chapter 23 in Tanya, the difference between a mitzvah and Torah, he says, and the world, existence comes from chitzenius haratzon. Because God built this world, like the home, the intention is not the home. The intention is not the building. The building is a means to an end. The means to the end is to turn it into a home for God. So Torah mitzvahs is the end. And neshama, that's why Bereshit is b'shvil ha-Torah, b'shvil hay, b'shvil Yisrael. Or like he said earlier, Tanai hitna Kadosh Baruch Hu, that God made a condition when he created the world, that the condition is that the neshamas, the Yisrael, would be mekabel, would receive the Torah and follow the Torah. That's the condition that existence exists. Existence is not an end in itself. So as such, neshamas therefore are coming from the pnimius of the deepest possible place, because they reflect what God actually wants. Torah and mitzvahs also reflect that, because they are those divine instruments. But when you really break it down, neshamas are even higher than Torah, as he explained on page 1406, which I'm not going to go over right now. But in understanding of neshama itself, the Rebbe Rashab went deeper and brought the Eitz Chaim, which we've already reviewed in the last class. I'm not going to read it in detail again, but basically explaining how the Boira, the Creator, imparted a piece of himself, so to speak, his very DNA, into the neshama, which in turn would have the power to then go into the world and achieve what needs to be achieved, which is fulfill that divine purpose, that the Boira, the Creator, should feel comfortable in this tachtenim, dir b'tachtenim. So here, going back to the example, the Father, just as an example, in this case, God sends the neshama, his child, into a building, into a world, in order to achieve something. And it has now the resource. First of all, the neshama has this power of koyach habeira, like he says, the nitzutz kotem ma'ed, which is elikus nimshach, from the lowest level, madrega achrena shebebeira. And this nitzutz manifests within the koyach nitzutz echad nivra, because it needs to enter into the world of nivra. And that's the neshama daka ma'ed ma'ed, the very, very refined soul, a very subtle, sublime soul, which is called Yechida, and then Yechida encompasses the next levels of the Giluyim of the four different levels of the soul as they manifest in existence. So here you have the interface at work. The Nitzutz Echad Beira coming from the Beira, manifesting inside Yechida. Yechida in turn manifests inside the other levels of the soul. They all enter into the body. The Neshama and Guf come down into this world, and they are ready to do what they have to do. Empowered with Torah and mitzvahs, they can achieve the goal, the mission for which they were sent. So using the example just helps understand, put it into real, I think, practical context. Okay, now, the last thing we learned, which let me go now, move over to page 1407, when he started talking, where are these levels? So he said, when you say Neshama Shenesata bi Tahirihi, says the level of Tahiri Ilah. So Tahiri Ilah, as we learned earlier, has many different levels. It could be Tahiri Ilah in Atzilus, it could be Tahiri Ilah at Ak, and Tahiri Ilah before the Tzimtzum, and even before the Tzimtzum itself, higher than Tahiri Tata, higher than the divine energy that does what? That's Shaykh La'elamus. Remember the pieces here. There's the world, there's Elikus, there's the Neshamas, and there's Torah mitzvahs. So in Elikus itself, there's Elikus, what he called Tahira Tata, or the Eagle HaGadol, or Arich, or the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra, using all the examples, or Dibur. These are all terms that he's used. That is the divine energy. It's already Ola B'Ritzene, what he called Kadmen, that rose in his desire to create existence. So it's a divine, relatively speaking, before the Tzimtzum, relates to existence, and to the point, Shir Asme B'Koyach, he measures and allocates resources, what will be needed, everything that will be needed for creation. Then comes the Neshamas that are higher than that. Ola B'Machshava, they come from the level of, first he says, like the level of Echad, that Koydem Alei Sarotz. You don't yet have the desire to create existence. It's Koydem Alei Sarotz. Why? Because they're rooted in the Pnimis HaKavana. Pnimis HaKavana is not the means, it's the end. Like we say, Save Ma'asav Machshav Tchila. If you ask God, what do you want? I want to dir b'tachtenim. How do I do that? You build a home, you build a building. So Alei Sarotz relates to the building. And the Neshamas relate to the purpose of why you're building the building, which is a deeper level. Then he goes even further and says there's really three levels. And Neshamas are actually rooted even higher than Kaidem Alei Saratz. They're rooted what he calls Ir Kol Batzmuse, the highest level, or what he called Yochid. And the last thing we learned that Yochid is the level of the Nitzutz Echad Boira. Because even though Yechida is the etzem of the neshama, but remember the neshama goes back, the Yechida is rooted, is a Nitzutz Echad Nivra, which is mislabish within it, the Nitzutz cotton of the Boira, which is the Madrega Achrena from the Boira. So now the neshamas have that, are rooted there. From there they enter into Yechida, which is Echad, Yechida Bekabel from Yachid, and from Yechida, Echad, it goes into Kadman, it goes into the four slower levels of the neshama as they manifest within all the worlds in Bria, in you could say Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya, all the way down below to achieve the purpose. So now the neshamas are linked, if you wish, right to the source, the engine room itself from the Beira. And that's essentially in simple English what he said, what we learned here. And then just a few more words. In the parentheses, he added from Shcheirani, the Maimon Lakuta Teira, what is this? Bechinas Achreina Sheba Ein Sof. So he says that's the level of Oir, that the level of Cholos Klinsa Oir is Achreina Sheba Ein Sof. Additionally, there's the Koyach and Yechelis of Hashem, God's power and capacity, which generally speaking is higher than the level of Oir. Because Oir, even Oir Hakol Batzmuse is still, you can say, well, I don't want to say Oir Hakol Batzmuse because that may be the level of Koyach and Yechelis. But bottom line is Oir, there's a level of Oir that is Oir. It's a field of energy. However you explain energy, Koyach and Yechelis is much more associated with God's power. Like you'd say God's Koyach to emanate Oir. Or God's Yechelis, even higher than Koyach, capacity to emanate Oir. That too, he says, is called, which is called the Shem HaKol Batzmuse, that too, which is Kadmin Kikadmuse, like the Eir HaKol Batzmuse, Kadmin Kikadmuse, it has that element of the Beira's so-called preceding everything before it manifests there. That's also called Achrena Sheba Maitzil. Why? Because that's not the Ikar of Elokus. As much as it's Beira, it's part of Beira, but you can't say that, like when you say that, you say that God is everything, but you don't say everything is God. You know, that essentially is pantheism. So you could say that God imparted a part of his very essential reality into the neshama, like we're learning. And in this case, even into Koyach and Yechelis and Oir HaKol Batzmuse, because Kadmik Kadmuse, but you don't say God is defined by that. That doesn't limit God. So God has given a part of that to a level. But you can't say that defines God. That's not the Ikar of Elokus, that that the worlds have been created by him. Now you have to say when he says Elamis here, I thought about it, he doesn't just mean Elamis, because if Elamis, that's back to Alei Saratzen. He's talking here levels that are higher than that. You have to say he means here everything. Elamis, including Oir, including everything. That's the way I would explain it, because if not, it just becomes, one second, why are you talking about Leiza Ikar Elokus Masha Elamis? But maybe the Ikar Elokus is to create Oir or Yechelis. But that too is B'chinas Achrena. So you have to say he means it in the broadest sense of the word. And in some places in Chassidus, the Taka says, so I just wanted to add that. I mentioned it yesterday. And this is Achrena Shebebeira. So based on this, he said, Yesh Lemer, the Shersha Neshamas, the root of the souls, is Shmei HaAtzmi. This Shmei HaAtzmi, that's Kol Batzmuse Mamish, a Kol Batzmuse. And that's Ola B'machshava. So now you see how Neshamas are linked all the way to the highest level. And this and Yechida is one level below that. And Yechida in turn, Kelelas Ba'atzme Kol B'chinas HaGiluya, meaning the levels below Yechida. Aval Etzem Sheresh Neshama is Yehochid Shalamayla Mailam B'chinas Mokir. And in this level, the Neshamas are higher than Torah and a Mashpia in Torah. So that's a summation of what he said here. Now, the next piece I want to say is this. To understand this better, we're going to need to learn the next page, and we are going to learn it soon. But I want to bring you back, and this I remember vividly when I've taught it the first time. I referred back to page 1252. So if you have the Sefer in front of you, you can turn there. If not, I'll explain it and read it. I want to just read a few lines from there because it'll help understand what it says here. And then I'll talk about the Yesh HaAmiti and Yesh Hanivra, which was asked yesterday and was discussed in the group. So in Aleph Reish Nun Beis, he says the following.
Where? What part of the page, please?
Right in the middle of the page. The new paragraph. If my memory serves me right, I remember when I did it last time, you asked exactly the same thing. Which part of the page? Check out the recording. I'm not saying that critically. I'm just deja vu.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there he talks about Torah and Neshama as the same idea. Obviously, it's a different context, but it's connected. But if you read the last two lines, let me just see where I want to start from. You know what? Let me go even further. Let's go back to page 1251. I'm just going to skip around. I just want to refer to a few lines. And the Rebbe Rashab wrote this. I mean, it's a good few. How many? This is 250. And now we're at 400. So we're talking about it probably 150 pages ago. But the Rebbe Rashab clearly know what he wrote there, and therefore, when he's saying here, it can only help to look there. So here's what he says. If you look, on page 1451, let me just see where I want to point out. I'm sorry, 1251. So in the beginning of the paragraph on page 1251, he says, literally what we're learning here. So there's a level of imi where the neshamas, there's a level of the neshamas where they're makabel from Torah. That's what he talks about earlier. And then there's a level of neshamas that mashpia into Torah. And then he goes on, and I'm not going to go read it. He goes on to speak about Torah as a manifest in Chachma, which gives direction and guidance of what is right and what is wrong, what is allowed, what is not allowed. That's what Torah does. Whereas neshamas, Aval neshamas, 4 lines from the bottom of 1251. Aval neshamas b'shoshanim ba'atzmus ha'chachma l'mayla ma'Torah. And here he brings the same Maimer Azal that we learned here earlier on the bottom of page on the bottom of page 1403, the Tonat Ve'el Yo. So he brings that there too. Kidua Maimer b'Tonat Ve'el Yo. I'm reading at the bottom of 1251. Shnei Dvarim Kodmu Le'elam. 2 things preceded existence. Torah v'Yisrael. Ve'eni Yadeya Ezemem Kedim. Emer Ani Yisrael Kodmu, because it says Tzavas B'nei Yisrael. V'Arayit L'Zeh Shari B'Torah Nemet Tzavas B'nei Yisrael. Daber al B'nei Yisrael. Hari Yisrael Kodmu. Literally what we learned in these pages that we're learning now. Nimtzu, Shanashamas Kodmu L'Torah. So we find from this, we derive from this, that Neshamas precede Torah. V'hainu Shagam B'Shosham, the next page, 1252. Shagam B'Shosham Mekedam. Kamei B'Pchinas Machshava Agduma Da'ak, which we also learned here. Kodma Sheirish Neshamas L'Sheirish HaTorah. That the root of souls precede the root of Torah. And then he goes on to speak about the same idea, Stakabar Raisa Bara Alma, that God looked into the Torah and created the world. So too, that's the level of Ak. That's Chitzenius Ak. All this was said earlier on page 1406, right? Mashenkin Torah. I'm skipping some lines. And Sheirish HaNeshamas, he says, Mishloshim ba'atzmus ein sof, that Torah b'chinas chochmah ein sof, and neshamas ein b'chinas ha'atzmus. So very similar to what we learned here. So I just read is not necessarily anything adds, it's just a good parallel. But then let's look at the next paragraph. So he says, V'agam da'raisa v'kudsha b'richu kulachad, even though Torah and Kudsha b'richu are all one. So how are you saying that neshamas are higher than that? Torah is mamish one with Hashem, with God. So he says, here is what he adds that we have not learned here, and we're learning now. He says, Kol zel b'chinas hagiluyim min ha'atzmus. When we're talking about the giluyim of Atzmus. Remember, Torah oir. Torah is a gili from Atzmus. Torah isn't just an atzmi. It comes in a state of gili. That's why we can learn it and understand it. And there's a wisdom to it. And there's a methodology that the neshamas use to illuminate. Because if Torah was an atzmi, just like neshamas, then you're back to like an eye that cannot see in a dark world. You need Torah to retain the light, because you need to illuminate the neshamas. The neshamas come down below, so they're atzmi, they have the etzem, but it's concealed. And that's why they need Torah to illuminate. So Torah is giluyim. Now giluyim here is not meant to be in a dismissive or low level, but he's saying it's all in giluyim mina atzmus. The bezei yesh ma'ala b'Torah al neshamas. And in this area, there's a quality of Torah over neshamas. The Torah kula chadim kudsha b'richu, but neshamas hem kamei davar b'fnei atzmei. This is why I wanted to read it, because he makes it very clear here. Because Torah retains its connection to kudsha b'richu all the time. Torah is essentially God's book, God's blueprint, God's wisdom, God's will. Whereas neshamas, once they come down below, they're like a davar b'fnei atzmei. Yes, they're rooted higher, and we'll talk about that shortly. But in giluyim, the neshama doesn't feel it, and no one feels it. That's why the work in this world is so difficult, because the tzimtzum has done its job. It's a big concealment. So the neshama retains a divine personality, obviously, but it does come down into our body and into an animal soul, and everyone can testify to the battles we have to fight with our animal soul, with a material world of materialism, of arrogance, of yeshes, of a world that worships itself more than it does God. So it comes down like a dover b'fnei atzmei. Aval kamei shehein ba'atzmus, that's giluyim. But if you're going back to the root in atzmus, hanashamas hein lamayla m'teira. The neshamas are higher than teira. Shein mishroshim ba'atzmus hein mamish kavyachol, because they're rooted all the way in atzmus hein mamish. Now keep in mind, this is what he means by nitzutz echad Hanivra, which manifests the nitzutz cotton beira. He's not contradicting that. When he says Atzmus here, he's not saying something different. Atzmus is a very broad word, but we're talking here Atzmus in contrast to Giluyim. Atzmus mamish. And then I'm going to just read a few lines in the parentheses.
Nitzutz echad beira, that's a yochid, not a nislabish b'nitzutz echad nivra. He's talking here about yochid. That's a nitzutz echad beira.
That's what I just said. Not
an Islamish.
Calls it nitzutz cotton beira. Just for the record, he calls it nitzutz cotton beira. By Nivra, he calls it nitzutz echad. But that's what I just said. Okay. So then in the parentheses he brings another mimer from Likutei Torah. Love and Mashakos Beitz Chaim, interestingly, is the same mimer that he referred to was what he called it Bedrush Hatzimtzum Barashimu. Is the same Maimon. He just calls it by a different name here. So there, he says like this, that even Makarat Tanugim, which is a very high level, the highest level, the source of all delights, is only Imcha, ki Imcha Makar Chaim. Is only Imcha, lo yatzmuse mohuse. And then he writes in that Maimer, Shatzmuse is Baruch Hu Makarat Tanugim, the Mitziyuse Matzmuse. So seems like a contradiction. So the Rebbe Rashab explains. Because in one sense he says it's only imcha, not atzmuse mehuse. Then he says atzmuse is mokar tanugim, and that's mitzuyusim atzmuse. So he explains there's two levels. Yesh lemer, shezeh b'chin shashuim atzmim detera. Say mokar tanugim, that's the root. Shashuim atzmim, the core delights that Torah is for Hashem. Remember we learned, that's why I wanted to bring it on page 1406, he said Torah is also Tainug Atzmi, but it's a Tainug Atzmi in Torah, in Chochmah, in something, Epis Vos. Whereas Neshamas is the Etzem itself. You don't, not without anything else. That's what he's going to say here as well. He says, like the Torah begins Tainug Atzmi Mamash Mesham Sheresh HaNeshamas.
Where are you? Which page? I can't see it.
1252. The middle of the page. Yesh le'emes le'b'chinas shashim az b'teiro b'chinas tainug atzmi mamash mesham sheresh haneshamas. So you see at two levels. One is the shashim atzmi of Torah. That's the mokra tonugim. That's not mitzis. That is not atzmus muhus. And b'chinas tainug atzmi mamash mesham sheresh haneshamas. There's the root of the souls. So what's the distinction between them? So he says, because remember, Mitzuyuse Matzmuse is an expression from the Alter Rebbe in Ageres HaKedesh Siman Chaf, that only God is a Mitzias that comes from within himself. Everything else has a source. When you say Mokar Tanugim, it means there's a source, that the Tanugim have a source. But when you say Mitzuyuse Matzmuse, you're talking about a level that has no source, Kadman. And now he's saying Kadmin Kekadmuse, and that's where the souls are rooted. And he brings also Samach Vav, same Samach Vav we learned yesterday here at the end of the paragraph on page 1407. Shame Hanikri Yechelis. So now he's associating shame and Yechelis. That's a level called shame. Shekol Batzmuse Mamish. But shame, as it's encompassed within Atzmuse Mamish, and he calls that Yechelis. So that's an additional kvetch, an additional knetch, if you wish, an additional point. And that's the root of the Shmei HaGodl, where the souls are rooted. I don't want to go into that in detail. So you see here clearly some additional points that add to the discussion of the difference between Torah and Yisrael. So
this is higher than Shashuim Atzmi in the Torah, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which he said on page 1406 explicitly. He said these words. That Torah is not Leia Tainu B'Atzmus Levad, She'en B'Shum Dover Klar. Torah is Shashuim Atzmim. Zel Makol Mokam Tainug B'Teira. Avol Neshamas and B'chinas Tainug Atzmi Mamish. Okay. So I just wanted to add that. So based on that, you see Yechelis and shame are connected. That's one key point. You also see the difference with Torah is more Giluyim, and Neshamas you talk more about Atzmus. Which
so
makes total sense.
Makes
total sense because the Neshamas, when they come down below, like he said, is a dover b'fnei atzmei, and they need Torah to direct them. So using the example, you're going to take a building, which is existence, the world, and you want to make them the tadir b'tachtenim, so the neshamas are the ones that activate that, obviously, and they have the power that goes all the way back to the koyach of Yachid, of the Beira, that manifests within the Yechida of the neshama daka b'moed moed, but the neshama itself does come down into the lower levels, and is concealed. And like he said here, it's a dover b'fnei atzmei. So Torah, however, retains its unity with God in a revealed way. Because when you look at Torah, Torah tells you how to live your life. The neshama itself may know it subconsciously or superconsciously in its own very DNA. You know, the neshama was taught the entire Torah in the mother's womb, but consciously we forgot. So what do we have? When you look at Torah, here, Torah says, what are you supposed to do? You have a building, you have a house, put a mezuzah on the door. You need a sefer Torah, you need film, you need all the different things that Torah directs us, because the Torah is revealing to us in a revealed way what God wants down on earth. So without the Torah, would the neshama be able to guess it? So certain things intelligence can figure out, certain moral laws, but most of them would not be able to be understood on our own. And even those that, yes, are understood with our own intelligence, doesn't have the whole profundity and the whole power as Torah reveals. So Torah is a revealed divine blueprint. The neshama, you can't say that about the neshama. The neshama, you could say, is a divine, it's a divine DNA. It's like a child of the divine, like a benoi ben from Etzem Moyach Ha'av. or even higher, like we're learning here. And together, the neshama and Torah achieve this purpose, with the Torah contributing this clarity and the riyah, the light that shines, that allows the eye to see, and the eye that sees is the neshama itself. And that's rooted in the mitzad etzem, mitzad the kavanah. Ultimately, is the neshama that's the ultimate. And that's why neshama can be mashpia, as is mashpia into Torah, as we learned here. So you have both parts, and both are necessary. They both complement each other. So that's somewhat of a summary and explanation of these ideas, a little more palatable. And I will now, unless somebody wants to, feel free to ask any questions. I want to address now the question of the Yesh HaAmiti, Yesh Hanivra that was brought up. Anybody wants to ask?
Wherever you put the Torah in the neshama compared to koyach, what do you say together with koyach?
Yechelis.
Based
on what the Rebbe Rashab says in 1407, it's very clear. That's the same level. He says Shmoya Atzmi is the root of neshamas. Shmoya Atzmi is Yechelis, which he calls Eira Kol Batzmusei. Shmoya Atzmi Mamash Kol Batzmusei, the level of Yochid, or the Nitzutz Echad Beira, or Nitzutz Kotten Beira, Bechinas Tachtena Shebe Madrega Achrena Shebe Beira, which is higher than Yechida, and where Yechida receives. That's the level. He says it explicitly. It's not my interpretation. He says it right here, the end of the paragraph on 1407. But there's going to be more about this in the next page. So it's not finished. I just summed up what we've learned with a little more elaboration. Okay, now.
I just have a little question.
The question was asked.
Just let me one more thing I didn't finish. The Torah is saying that this is lower than the neshama. Why is it more chelak from the Atzmus, not a chelak? This is one thing, and the neshama is an extension, a ben.
I didn't understand the question. Why is the Torah not like neshamas? Well, I didn't understand your question. Can you repeat it?
No, my question is, the neshama is mushrosh ba'atzmus in a highest level.
Use the words from the Maimon. He says it's mushrish in the madrega. It's mushrish in the nitzutz cotton beta, madrega achreina shebe beta, which is the level of yochid, the level of shmoi, yechela, shmei atzmi, etc. The next level is yechida. Yechida is the next level. It's already is what he would call here yochid echad. Kaidam alei sarotz.
When you compare Torah to Yechida, is Torah compared to the level of Yechida?
So you have to go back to page 1406 where he discussed that. He said the following. He said there that generally Torah is chitzenius ak and neshamas are pnimius ak. Neshamas are like an atik and Torah is arich. But then he said pnimius Torah is also atik, tainug. But neshamas are even higher than that. They're like the tainug, the atik, that's higher than the galgalta, the ak. Then that's what he said on page 1406. So then Torah is even higher than pnimius hatera. Sorry, neshamas are higher than pnimius hatera. That's what he said there. So when it depends, when you're talking on those levels, Yisrael kodmu l'Torah. That's what the Medrash says. When you talk on lower levels, Torah kodmu Yisrael, because the shamas need Yisrael, need Torah to illuminate. And then he goes on to say that Torah is the tainuk shebechachme, tainuk shebeTorah. So it's tainuk shashrim atzmim. You have the sefer in front of you?
Yeah.
So go look. Saying. I listen.
I see it.
Go read. Whatever you're asking, he himself answers. You don't need me for it. Just read the words. He says like this. He says, Torah is shashrim ha'atzmim, makol mokim ha'tainug b'Torah. Aval neshamas emchinas tainug ha'atzmim mamish. And then he goes on to explain the tipa and the ruach. But That's what he says. So the shamas are higher.
So my question is, for what purpose they need the Torah?
What's your question?
For what purpose the neshamas need the Torah? In the way that they are in the Sheresh.
You're really asking me that question after this last almost hour that I'm reviewing?
Yeah, I hear that you said that the neshama is mechutz la'atzmus.
Do you see the violence and the wars in the world today?
Okay.
We have a nefesh habamis, even with a Torah. Even with Torah, look at the difficulties we have. One second, can someone put it?
George,
mute
can you
yourself?
mute yourself? George, please mute yourself.
Even with a Torah, we have such problems. We barely can make it. We have a nefesh habamis, we have violence, we have war, we have murder. I'm not clear why you even ask such a question, to be honest. Even with a Torah. Without a Torah, we'd have altogether no direction. So what's the question?
That means because the neshama, the way it's coming down to this world.
I just read a dover b'fnei atzmei, it's concealed. The neshama and so on. Why did Hashem give Torah? You're asking a question. Why do we need Matan Torah? Why can't we just do it on our own?
Why is it concealed? This is my question. Why?
Because that's the kavanah, dira b'tachtenim. Hashem wanted a dira b'tachtenim. If it was all revealed, what do we need to do anything? Then it's all revealed. There's no aveda.
Okay.
I have a related question about mitzvahs r'tzonecha, because you said we're talking about needing the Torah to guide us, and that there are certain certain mitzvahs that we would know, like Bikur Cholim or anything like anything
the
that's
Gemara
not...
says that even the Torah was not given, God forbid, we can learn tznius from a cat. There's certain moral laws that human beings to coexist can figure out, but that's what I said. Yeah.
But because I noticed the word Kemoshe kasavsa aleinu b'sorsecha, like you wrote it on us, that we are somehow able to figure out, maybe not the lulav and esrog, because that needs to be spelled out, but maybe there's other day-to-day
99% we would not know, firstly, and even the 1% we would know, it would not be with all the depth and power that Torah tells us. In other words, you could figure out that it's a kind thing to give tzedakah, but the details of that, when do you give tzedakah, when don't you, to whom, and so on, it's a whole other dimension when it's a Torah dika mitzvah, whether then it's just used on human intelligence. You're asking me the difference between human morality and divine morality from the Torah? It's infinitely distant.
Really, I'm asking because I heard of this idea of mitzvahs ritzonecha, that mitzvahs ritzonecha is that your will, that my will is Hashem's will, and that
it's not related to this at all. It's not related to this. If for years and years you follow Torah and mitzvahs, ultimately your natural will be aligned with God's will. That's what you mean. But not on our own.
I don't know what I mean.
There's a reason. Are you asking why we need Torah and mitzvahs? Why can't we just figure it out on our own?
No, but I think I'm more trying to figure out if mitzvahs ritzonecha has to. I think it's more.
I never heard mitzvahs ritzonecha interpreted the way you just said. Mitzvahs ritzonecha says that when Mashiach comes, we will do mitzvahs aligned completely with the way Hashem, Rambam says. We'll know how to do all the mitzvahs properly. That's how I understand mitzvahs ritzonecha. So if you have a source that says something, I don't see the connection here at all. But okay, I'll just use, since it's already late, I'll just use a few minutes to explain. So a question was asked, you asked a question, and also then in writing showed some sources from the Sichos of the Rebbe. Just for the record, I wrote that Sicha, Chav Beis Shvat Tav Shin Nun Beis. When I say I wrote it, it's the Rebbe Sicha, but I'm the one that wrote it up and the Rebbe edited it. So I'm quite familiar with it, and with hundreds of others similar Sichas. So there's an expression that you find in the Sichas of the Rebbe, Yesh HaAmiti. The Yesh Hanivra is one with the Yesh HaAmiti. Now, number one, as I said yesterday, loud and clear, and I say it again unequivocally, the Rebbe did not come to change Chassidus. Anything the Rebbe says has a source, and everything is aligned with the Eitz Chaim of the Arizal and the Tanya Ayin Beis about a chelik elikam and mal mamish, and what it says here in Ayin Beis. You're not going to find any contradictions. I would challenge anyone to find a contradiction in that area. You're not going. Of course, you'll find things from the Rebbe that the Rebbe added nuances or explanations or even new ideas, but not regarding these topics. These topics are etched in stone. It says in the Torah, "Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim." The Zohar says, "B'techi yusei mepnimi yusei." The Tanya explains, "Chelik elikam mal mamish," and this is not even sourced in Tanya. It really originates even earlier sources. Shefatal. I'm not going to go to all the Kabbalistic sources. So, just when you're talking about, in general, any topic, and I say this across the board to everyone, always have to trace it in sources. If you don't find all the sources, then you're really, you can quote a sikha and I have no problem with that, but every sikha is based on something. Who said the word Yesh HaAmiti in the first place? Who said Yesh Hanivra? And what are we talking about? Are we talking about Yesh HaAmiti, Yesh Hanivra? Are we talking about the body? Are we talking about the soul? Are we talking about Torah? Are we talking about the world? They're very different realities. When we say here that Neshama is a chelik elikam mal mamish in Tanya, and then you say Yesh HaAmiti and Yesh Hanivra, is that saying that not just the Neshama, but everything is a chelik elikam mal, because Yesh HaAmiti and Yesh Hanivra are one? We understand that is obviously not coming to say that a frog or a tree or a physical stone is like a neshama, chelik elikam, because then the whole Tanya falls apart. It's a nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael has chelik elikam and mal mamish. 6 days of creation, only one creation did God give a nishmas of a yipach ba'ap of nishmas chayim. No one's can ever negate that. That's not negotiable. That's not a discussion even. There's nowhere anyone will say such a thing. So then we have to understand, what does he mean? So let me just say a few words about what he means, and you'll understand it quite simply, actually. It's not that complicated. But the reason I'm able to do this is because I'm going to quote sources. The word Yesh HaAmiti and Yesh Hanivra originates in maybe earlier, but definitely Tanya Ageres HaKejes Siman Chof. Let's start with that. What does he say there? He says that in order to create a Yesh, a Nivra, those are the words, existence that feels that it doesn't have a source. Someone asks you, do you feel you come from somewhere? No. I know I have parents. I know my parents had parents. I believe that God created us all, but I don't feel it. It's not like you feel the rush of life coming to you from somewhere else. When you contemplate, of course, it makes sense. So he says, where did that feeling come from? The idea that a Yesh does not feel it has a source. So the Alter Rebbe says, a Chiddush. And he wrote the Ageres HaKedes just a few weeks or a short time before he passed away. And he says, it comes from the Yesh HaAmiti, the true Yesh. Exact Lashon I'm quoting from Tanya. Ageres HaKedes Chof. Since Atzmus is Mitzuyusim Atzmuse, like we just learned, I referred you to page 1252. He's the only true reality that has no source. Nothing precedes him. He precedes everything. He creates everything. He infused that into the Yesh HaNivra, that the Yesh HaNivra should also feel like it has no source. But remember, the Yesh HaNivra does have a source. It's God. It just doesn't feel it. And therefore, so the Alter Rebbe's brilliance here is saying that that feeling that it doesn't have a source, maybe it's just an illusion. Maybe just fake, we have to overcome it and realize we do have a source. So he says, no, the very fact that the Yesh has that ability not to feel its source, as in contrast to Oyer, that always feels its source. Remember, light always knows where it's coming from. Light, sunlight, is an extension, expression of the sun. Moonlight, candlelight, all light. Everything knows and recognizes, all the Elamis, L'mayel Malachim, and so on, and the angels, they all know they have a source, they feel it. The fact that we cannot feel a source means that we have that koyach ha'atzmus, so to speak, of the Yesh HaAmiti, so to speak, in some way, part of that we should feel that type of independence. The goal, of course, is to come to realize that Yesh HaNivra's feeling is coming from Atzmus. that itself is coming from Atzmus. That we don't feel a source itself is coming from a source called Atzmus. That's the Tanya Geras HaKedesh. Then we go to the next step. In Biuri Hazeir of the Mittler Rebbe, in Vayishlach. And if you want to look it up, I posted a sikha from Chukas Tovshim Memches. I posted an image of it on the group. Those few footnotes there quotes it directly. He goes a step further and says, based on that, that means that the Yesh Hanivra has a capacity to reconnect to the Yesh HaAmiti in a way that Oyer does not have. Because Oyer can only connect you to the source because it feels the source. But who can connect you to the Mitziusim Atzmusei? Only a Yesh. So paradoxically, the entity that doesn't feel a source can reveal to us something about the source, meaning Atzmus, that's higher than source, called Mitziusim Atzmusei. Now, the question then is asked, so what is this Yesh that he's talking about? In Tanya, in the Geras HaKedesh, it seems like all Yesh, because he's talking about the world. He's talking about all of us, talking about every human being, not just neshamas, not just Jews, all humans and all creation, frankly, feels that sense of self, if you wish, self-containment. But from Beyur Hazer, it seems as the neshamas dafke. And that's the footnote that I posted because I want you to see it. There he goes into a discussion. So Yesh Hanivra, Yesh HaAmiti, are we talking about whom? Are we talking about the physical world? We're talking about everybody? We're talking about neshamas? Are we talking about gufim, bodies? So that I'll leave you. You can read those footnotes. They talk about it more in detail. The bottom line is, and I'll say the conclusion of it all, that ultimately neshamas always have a certain, you'll say, superiority. I don't like that word, but a certain quality that nothing else has. That's never going to change. Toned Ve'elyo that says Yisrael Kodmu is not going to change once Mashiach comes and the world is Adir B'Tachtein. Let me go back to the example, which is one of the reasons I gave it. The building, which is the world, which will become a home for God, is never going to become a neshama. It's not the child of God. It's still a building. The difference is that today the building is not aware of its creator, or not completely aware. And the Asad Lavi, the Yesh HaNivra, will completely be saturated with awareness of the Yesh HaAmiti. And that's why I also posted the last page of Ayin Beis. He Mama says it in different words. What are the words of the last page? He says clearly, he says like this. That's existence. But existence is not the child of God. Existence is not a neshama. Existence now has fulfilled its purpose. The neshama has taught existence to serve as a vehicle and a channel for godliness, even for the highest level of godliness, Yesh HaAmiti. But it's still not a neshama and a neshama beguf, like he says in that footnote, because the world was created for neshamas, not the other way around. Another point, he doesn't say anywhere that the Yesh HaAmiti is the Yesh HaNivra. That would be like saying that the Boira is the Nivra. And we say, even on the highest level, we say the Nitzutz Cotton of the Boira, Madrega Achrena Sheba Boira, is what goes into the Yechid. So it's like saying, yes, existence is God, but God is not existence because God is far beyond. Like we learned, Leiza Ikar Elikus. So bottom line is, the world will be saturated, the Yesh of existence, not just of humans, not just of Neshamas Begufim, not just Neshamas Yisrael, the world, including the non-Jewish world, will be completely saturated with the awareness that it's essentially united with Atzmus, with the highest levels of the divine. But it doesn't mean it's a child of God. It's different roles. Everything has its role. And that's why it's important to have practical examples, or else you're just wandering in words and semantics without really understanding what are we talking about it. That's why I said, nothing will ever be the Torah, mitzvahs, Neshamas Yisrael, the world, and God. Those are the pieces. And then this is how they all interplay with each other. This is briefly an understanding of all of what we're discussing here. We're later going to learn how the neshamas, using Torah and mitzvahs, create this transformation and ultimately will transform the animal soul and the world into being, like we just said, a yichud gomer with elikus, with atzmus. But that is the work we need to do. That comes through Avodah. And who's doing the work is the neshamas that have this divine power all the way rooted in Yochid, or what he calls the Nitzvus Katan Beda, and all the way, and using Torah mitzvahs, and mitzvahs as well, like he explains in chapter 23 in Tanya, that mitzvahs are called Ramach Evarim de Malka. They're like Evarim itself, where he explains the different levels between Torah and mitzvahs, how each of them achieve the yichud in a different level. But bottom line is, that is somewhat of a summation. So we didn't learn anything, any new text, but I thought it was good to go overview of the entire topic, try to address some of the questions, and I hope this is helpful. And as I said, if you look at Chukas Memches, you'll see interesting things there, very interesting about this whole topic. Okay. Adkan. So anybody wants to ask anything, any comments, any questions?
First of all, that was wonderful. It was a tour de force. I don't know if you want to get into this. It's late, and we're going to study it over the next few days. But can you just very, very briefly explain the difference between Shmo, his name, and his Yecholet?
He actually says Shmo is Yecholet. On page 1252, he said Shmo is the level of Yecholet.
Okay. And what does it mean, Shmo versus Atzmus himself? It's almost like, I remember when we first started talking about the creation, and essentially Shmo is slightly, well, I don't know, you please answer. I don't remember the difference between Shmo and Atzmus.
Well, because God wanted this to be a logical process, he didn't do it in a way that makes it, he did it in a way that makes it most sense. So even though Atzmus can do whatever he wants, but Atzmus is so removed from definitions, from concepts, from revelation, from expression even. So how can we relate to something that completely built in Metzias Nimtza, called a non-existential existence? So what Hashem did, because he has the capacity to do anything, I don't want to call it created, but he manifested a level called Yechelis. Yechelis means, God's capacity. That's already not, as soon as you say that, you're not saying Atzmus Mamish. It's his capacity, and it says one with him. Because Yechelis are Atzmus. But you're already giving language to something in order for us to be able to begin discussing it. Shmoy is the same idea. You don't need a name, and I don't need a name if we're alone in this world. A name is only for others to be able to call you by name. You don't need a name. So a name, but it's your name. It's not my name. It's not someone else's name. So the name is associated with the entity, but it's already, so to speak, one step, very small step, because it's not yet anything but the etzem, but it's already a name of the etzem. So you're giving it something. Shmaya Atzmi, you can't even say Havaya, you don't say any name, but you're saying there's a name. It means that God has chosen, and even the word chosen is not the proper word because it's a rotzen is also, but in some way God has manifested in the beginning of being able to talk about him. So that's one way to explain it. There are many ways to explain it, but bottom line, it's the first step outside of Atzmus, if you wish. When I say outside, I don't mean outside. I mean outside of pure Atzmus that doesn't have any language and no definition, and we wouldn't be here to talk about it. Like I always point out that even your own etzem, the deepest part of you is not expressible, really. You're not going to find words. You're not going to find metaphors. You won't even find a sound. It's just who you are. Etzem is etzem. It doesn't need to be expressed. But the Eibishter wanted expression. He wanted Giluim, and he wanted a world, and he wanted us to do the work. So Shmoy, you could say, is like that first step, or Yechelis, is where you say, okay, now, so I'm connecting to God's capacity, so to speak. And then will then slowly evolve. That's Eira Kol Batzmusei. Then there's the Eir, like he said, and there are many levels in between, over and under, if you start really breaking it down. And
I remember now. It's that aspect of the Eibishter to which we can relate.
Relate is a big word. I don't know if I'd use the word relate, but yes, let's put it this way. It's the beginning of relating.
The beginning of God's expression.
In some fashion. Remember, it's all before the Tzimtzum.
Yes,
The
I hear you.
shame, there is something which is higher than shame. I think it's called koyach, right? Because a shame is a more external thing.
Not what he says here. If you're going to bring other Maimorim, it's fine. What he said here is Shmoi Hanikri Yechelis. That's what he called it.
Yeah, I know, but in general,
Not
I think
necessarily. Yechelis is, I think, higher than Koyach.
no, but koyach is higher than shame.
No, but if Yechelis is shame, Shmoi Atzmi, and Koyach is lower than Yechelis, so Koyach is lower than shame. In this context here. Again, if you have another mimer, maybe we'd have to look it up. There's generally Oyer, Koyach, and shame. That's correct. But that's not what he's talking about here. At the end of volume 1 in Ayin Beis, he talked about Oyer, Koyach, and shame. Okay. So we'll stop here. Call it a review of the review. The end of the paragraph, we're still end of paragraph 1407, but I think this was very helpful to me as well. And
Can I ask you a question about Atzmus, and what do you think the connection is to bones? You think it's because of the physicality of the?
I don't know if there is a connection to bones.
It has to be. It's the same word.
I don't know where did you get that rule? Just because something is the same world means it's the same level?
Yeah, I heard that. I heard that that's a rule. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that's a rule. I mean, yeah, if you start to push it, you could start saying a bone is unmovable. You know, you say, well, why is a bone called an etzem? I'm sure you could figure out things, but I don't know how I would compare it to Atzmus, Bilti Metzias Nimtze, and Tzusim Atzmuse. I don't know if I could do that. I mean, if you want to say that a bone is like the Yesh Hanivra, I don't know. If the Rebbe said it, it's possible. I wouldn't go that far necessarily. So even if there's a connection, I don't know if you can say that physical bones is a reflection of Atzmus that we're talking about here.
It's pretty glaring, though, that it's the same word.
The same word does not mean same meaning. Same word doesn't mean anything, in my view. I could tell you a lot of words in Hebrew that are the same and they're not necessarily connected.
The Rebbe
You could connect it. I didn't say you can't. But sometimes, you know, it's not the same. You wouldn't translate Atzmus Mahu's bones, correct?
Right.
So right there, you have the same word. So I don't even, you know, the question is, why bones are called bones? That's an interesting question. Anyway, I would look up these things. I'd try to find a source to see, maybe someone does explain why bones are called Atzmus and or that it has a connection. I mean, practically speaking, in a human body, I can understand the bone structure, the skeletal structure, is a certain type of foundational element, as opposed to the flesh that covers the bones. So in that sense, the bones are like the etzem, and the flesh is like hispashtus.
And maybe within them they hold the blood that the blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't see the connection. I mean, that would be the practical way of explaining that bones are like the core, like the skeletal foundational structure of the body. Anyway.
So what I understood from you is that it's not a two-way street. That's like my takeaway from, I mean, I have a lot of takeaways because I learned a lot today, but one of the takeaways is that it's not a two-way street, that it could be that we are one with Hashem's Atzmus. Our Atzmus is one with Hashem's Atzmus, but it's not, but Hashem is not one with our Atzmus.
Meaning that we don't define Hashem. Even if we're united and we're extension, that we don't define, he's not defined by us. We're defined by him, but he's not defined by us. Yes. We learned it in the Mittler Rebbe's mind where he said, Iu tough is bekulu, but kulu is not tough is in him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like saying, I mentioned pantheism. Pantheism is God is nature, nature is God. And God doesn't have anything that's beyond nature. We can't have Shalom to say that. Whereas we'll say nature is God, but God is also beyond nature.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop here. Let's conclude this.